Let's start the homework questions on section 1.4. And for the first question, without a calculator, I need to decide if the numbers are rational or irrational. So rational numbers are kind of like your nice numbers, kind of like 2, 4, 6. And irrational numbers, I call them ugly numbers. They're numbers where you can't really predict the decimal expansions. Numbers like root 2 and pi. Those are examples of irrational numbers. So let's take a look at question 1a. The square root of 81, is that a rational or irrational number? Well, I know the square root of 81 is going to be 9, and 9 is a nice number, so this is a rational number. Okay, for the next three questions, letter B, C, and D, I'm going to do all three of these at once. And when you're dealing with square roots of numbers that have zeros, so here's a 0, here's a 0, and here's a 0, what you have to do is count out the number of zeros. So here we have 1 0. This is also 1 0 here. And our last one, we have 2 zeros. Okay. So when you're taking the square root of a number, and if you have zeros at the end, if you have an even number of zeros, such like letter D, 2 zeros, that's an even number. If you have an even number of zeros, and when you take the square root of that number, you will always get a nice number. So I already know that letter D gives me the very nice answer, so this is going to be rational, and these are going to be irrational. These will not give you nice answers. All right, so when you're taking the square root of a number, and if you have zeros at the end, if you have an even number of zeros, you will always get a nice answer. And for letter D, I know letter D is rational, so if you want to figure out what this answer was, I would start off with the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is 2. And since you have 2 zeros there, you take your 2 zeros and you just divide that by 2 to get 1 0. So you just add 1 extra 0 there and your answer is 20. So 20 times 20 is 400. Okay, let's move on to the next 4 questions here. Okay, so now we have decimals here. And what we're going to do is we're going to count out the number of decimal places for the next 4 questions here. So I'm just going to highlight the decimal places here. So here I have 1 decimal place. Here I have 2 decimal places. Here I have 3 decimal places. And over here I have 4 decimal places. Okay, so when you're taking the square root of a number with decimals, if you have an even number of decimal places, then you will always end up with a nice answer. So for letter F and letter H, I have an even number of decimal places, so I know that these are my rational numbers. And I know that these are going to be irrational. The irrational situations will not give me a nice number. Okay, and if you want to figure out how to calculate letter F, I would start to think about the square root of 64. So the square root of 64 is 8, right? And then since you have 2 decimal places, what you want to do is you want to divide the decimal places in half. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. So you're going to have 1 decimal place in your answer. So this will be 0.8. So this is 1 decimal place. All right, so there's your answer, 0.8. For letter H now, take the square root of 4. Now the square root of 4 is 2. And since you have 4 decimal places, divide that by 2, and that should give you 2 decimal places. So your answer should be 0.02. And as you can see, here are my 2 decimal places, right? And that's how you can calculate the answers for letters F and H. And for this problem, you're just counting up the number of decimal places for these next 4 questions there. Okay, so move on to K and L. K and L, this is a very nice one, where if you're taking the square root of something, and if there's a square there, then basically what's happening is that the square root and that power 2, they just cancel each other out, and you're left with the inside number, which is 32. So this is a rational number. And same with letter I. If you're taking the square root of a number that has a power of 2, the square root and the power 2, they cancel off, and you're just left with the inside number, which is 0.32. And this is a nice number here because the decimals terminate, so this is a rational number. Great. Okay, let's move on to the next question here. Without a calculator, decide if the numbers are rational or irrational. Okay, well, let's take a look at the very first one, the cube root of 1. Well, this equals to 1 because we need to find 3 numbers that are exactly the same, and if you multiply them together, you have to get 1, right? So that's the same thing as 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1. So the cube root of 1 is going to be 1. Okay, what we're going to do next is, because these are all cube roots here, for B, C, and D, we have to determine whether these are rational or irrational numbers here. And what you want to do is you want to count the number of zeros again. Okay, so over here you have 1 0. Over here you have 2 zeros. And over here you have 3 zeros. Okay, so when you're taking the cube root, sorry, letter A is rational. If you're taking the cube root of a number and if you have zeros, what you want to do is you want to look for the number zeros, and you have to make sure that the zeros are divisible by 3. Because you're taking the cube root, right? You want to make sure that the number zeros are divisible by 3. So clearly 1 is not divisible by 3. 2 is not divisible by 3. However, 3 divided by 3, that gives you 1, right? So this works out really nice. So this will give you your rational number here, and these are going to be irrational. All right, so just look for the number of zeros to make sure that it is a multiple of 3. And if you have a multiple of 3, then that means you have a rational number here. And the cube root of 1,000 is going to be 10, right? So 10 times 10 times 10 gives you 1,000. So this answer here is just 10. Okay, let's move on to the next one here, the next 4. Okay, let's start with letter E here. The cube root of 8 is going to be 2, which is a rational number, and that's because 2 times 2 times 2 gives you 8. And once again, for the next few here, let's count the number of zeros here. Here's 1, here's 2, and here's 3. So since we have 3 zeros here, 3 is divisible by 3, so this is a rational expression, and these are irrational. So irrational means not a nice answer. And for letter H, if you want to compute what that answer is, ask yourself, what is the cube root of 8? Well, the cube root of 8 is 2. And how many zeros do you have again? You have 3 zeros. So what you have to do is you take 3 and, you take 3 and you will divide by 3. And 3 divided by 3 gives you 1, right? So you must have 1 0 in your answer. So your answer is going to be 20. All right, so the cube root of 8,000 is going to be 20, and 20 times 20 times 20 gives you 8,000. So that's a nice little check there if you want to figure out what the cube root of 8,000 is. But since you have 3 zeros, it is irrational. Sorry, since you have 3 zeros there, it's going to be rational. Okay, let's move on to the next ones here, okay? All right, so for the next ones here, let's just count the number of zeros again. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and then there's 4. So I know that since there's 3 zeros here, this is your rational answer, and the rest of them will not give you nice answers. Okay, let's move on. I believe for question number 3, you just have to use a calculator to approximate the irrational numbers to 2 decimal places. So just make sure that you can get these numbers using your calculator here. I probably won't spend any time doing these kind of problems because you just input the numbers into a calculator. Okay, let's move on to question number 4. I'd say question number 4 is probably, I think for me to explain, is probably going to be the harder homework questions from section 1.4. And what you're given is, you're given that the square root 21 is 4.58 approximately, and you're given that the square root of 210 is 14.49 approximately. And based on those two values, you need to determine the value of the square root. So I need to figure out what is the square root of 2.1. Okay, so the way we're going to solve this particular problem is, first of all, you have to decide whether you're going to use the blue approximation, this one here, or the green approximation. That's kind of step 1. So one of them will help you, the other one will not. And the way that you might want to think about what option to use is, look at the number of decimal places here. I have 1 decimal place in this particular problem here. And 1 decimal place has to do with 1 decimal place. 1 represents like an odd number, right? An odd number, right? So when I look at my blue expression here, 21, I have 2 numbers here. So this is kind of like your even situation. And over here I have 3 numbers. So this is your odd situation. All right, so you want to match odd with odd. So for this very first question, the square root of 2.1, since you have 1 decimal place, and 1's an odd number, you want to use this approximation to help you. Okay. All right, so that's step number one. We're going to establish which square root we want to use to help us out, and we're going to use the square root 210 for this particular case. Now think about 2.1. You want to write that as a fraction now, and you want to get 210, right? So you want to get 210 here, right? So if you go from a 2.1 to a 210, you have to take your 210 and you actually have to divide by 100 here, right? So 2.1 is the same thing as 210 divided by 100, okay? And then our question is, I want to find the square root of 2.1. So what you can do here is you can take the square root of that entire piece, and this breaks down into the square root of 210 divided by the square root of 100. The square root of 100 is not too hard to figure out. That's 10. And now we know that this approximation, we can use this guy over here, which is going to be 14.49. Okay. Now when you're dividing by 10, which we are in this case, we're dividing by 10, you just move the decimal spot 1 over, so it'll be 1.449. And that's your final answer for 4A. Okay. After that, let me jump down to letter D here, because I think letter D kind of matches up nicely with 4A. All right, so do you want to use the blue approximation, square root 21, or do you want to use the green approximation, which is the square root 210? All right, so this is how we kind of figure the first part out. Count the number of decimal places. Here's 1, 2, 3. There's 3 decimal places, and 3 is an odd number. All right, so if I have an odd number there, I want to use this approximation here, and that's because 210, there's 3 digits there, and 3 digits is an odd number. Okay, after that, we have 0.021, which is that inside number, and I want to be able to use the square root of 210 somehow in my answer here. So since I want to use the square root of 210, I want to write this decimal as the number 210. Okay, so think about 210. What do I need to divide 210 by to get back to 0.021? Okay, so the trick here is if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 spots, you should have 4 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 1. Okay, so we're going to divide by 10,000. All right, so now we want to take the square root of 0.021, which is the same thing as the square root of 210 divided by 10,000. And then if I do this individually here, this will be the square root of 210 all over the square root of 10,000. All right, let's continue here. The square root of 10,000 is going to be 100. And basically, remember 210, the square root of 210 is going to be 14.49. So 14.49. Okay, and then if we're dividing by 100 here, since there's 2 zeros, you just move the decimal spot 2 spots over. So 1, 2. So our final answer is 0.1449. And that's going to be it for this first homework video guide. I'll continue the rest of the problems on the second video.